Have you ever looked at a map like this and just seen chaos? It's this tangled web of connections. Well, in this explainer, we're going to try and untangle some of that. We're going to dive into the invisible system that gets basically everything you own from point A to point B. I'm talking about world trade.
All right, just take a second and think about your day so far. That coffee you had this morning, the phone you might even be watching this on, the clothes you're wearing. Chances are every single one of those things traveled thousands of miles just to get to you. So, why? I mean, why isn't everything just made down the street? That's the big question we're going to tackle.
Okay, so the answer really boils down to two core economic ideas. And I know, that sounds kind of academic and maybe a little dry, but trust me, these two concepts are the engine driving literally every container ship, every cargo plane, every single time something crosses a border. So first up, we've got something called complementarity. And it's actually super simple. It's just one country has a thing that another country needs, right? So imagine a country that's sitting on a ton of oil, and then you have another country that's full of brilliant engineers but has no oil. They trade. It's a perfect match. They fill in each other's gaps. Simple as that. Okay, the second idea is a bit of a mind bender, but it's so important. It's called comparative advantage. Here's the best way to think about it. Imagine you have this world-class chef who also, randomly, is a super fast cleaner. So should she spend her day cooking and cleaning? Absolutely not. Her time is way too valuable in the kitchen. It makes way more sense for her to just focus on cooking incredible food and pay someone else to clean, right? Even if that person is a bit slower at cleaning than she is. That is comparative advantage. It's not about being the best at everything. It's about doubling down on what you do most efficiently. And you see the specialization playing out all through history. For like centuries, China basically owned the global silk market because they could make it way more efficiently than anyone else. Fast forward to the late 20th century, and you have Japan becoming this absolute giant in high-tech electronics, microchips and computers. They weren't trying to do it all. They focused, they specialized, and they imported the rest. But here's the thing. All this trading, all this specialization, it can't just be a free-for-all. For this whole system to work on a global scale, you need some rules of the road. You need a framework. A shared philosophy, really. And for the past, several decades, the main philosophy driving things has been something called neoliberalism. Okay, that is a very loaded word, I know. But if we just strip it down to its economic core, it's basically this idea. Trade works best when governments get out of the way. Less meddling, fewer barriers, just let the market do its thing. And this whole way of thinking gave rise to these incredibly powerful trade organizations. You've got these big regional groups, right, like the European Union or Mercosur in South America, that basically acts like one giant market. Then you have groups that focus on one thing, like OPEC, which has this huge influence over oil. And then you have the global referee, the World Trade Organization, the WTO. They're the ones who are supposed to make sure everybody's playing by the rules. But playing by the rules, a fair game, that doesn't always happen, does it? The reality is that this big idea of perfectly free trade often runs headfirst into what individual countries want for themselves. And that's when you get friction, you get barriers, and sometimes you get full-blown trade wars. So what's the number one weapon in these fights? It's the tariff. A tariff is just a tax that a government puts on stuff coming into the country, and they use them for a couple of key reasons. Okay, so on one hand, it's about protecting your own industries. Let's say you slap a big tax on an imported Volvo. Suddenly, that American-made Ford looks a lot cheaper, right? The government's hoping you'll buy the Ford. That's one reason. But on the other hand, tariffs can be used as a political weapon. Just look at the trade war between the US and China. That was all about using taxes as leverage to try and get a strategic leg up. And this is the really crucial point. These fights have real, serious consequences. The source material puts it pretty bluntly about that US-China conflict, saying it arguably left both economies worse off. See, there wasn't really a winner. That's because tariffs aren't like these precise surgical tools. They're more like economic grenades. They blow up prices for everyday people and create a total mess for businesses trying to get the parts they need. And it's not just tariffs either. Governments have a whole toolbox. They can use quotas, which basically put a cap on how much of something can be imported. They can give out subsidies, which is just cash to help their own industries. Or they can create all kinds of tricky regulations that just happen to make things harder for foreign companies.
Okay, so all of this, it leads us to maybe the single biggest risk in our modern global system. Because all of these connections, all this trade, it means we're all deeply, deeply dependent on each other. And when you're that connected, you're also incredibly vulnerable. There's this fantastic phrase in the source material that I just have to share: a globalized economic hug fest. I mean, what a great picture, right? But think about it. We're all locked in this hug, so tangled up that a problem over here is never just a local problem anymore. It sends shockwaves rippling across the entire planet.
And if you want a perfect and, frankly, terrifying example of this, just look at the 2008 financial crisis. It all started with sketchy housing loans in the US, but because the world's financial systems are all wired together, it didn't stop there. No way. It exploded outwards like a contagion and triggered a massive global recession that hurt people in pretty much every single country on the map.
So, that begs the question, right? What happens when that web starts to break? How do you stop one little tear from unraveling the whole thing?
Well, one of the main answers we have is the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The easiest way to think of them is like the world's economic firefighters. When a country's economy is basically on fire and about to collapse, the IMF can rush in with emergency loans. They help that country get its debt under control and hopefully stop a financial crisis from spiraling into a total social or political meltdown.
But it's not all about these huge top-down bailouts. If you go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you find something called microlending. This is a totally bottom-up approach. We're talking about giving really small loans directly to individuals, a lot of times in the developing world, so they can start a small business. It's this incredible way of building stability and plugging people into the global economy, literally one person at a time.
And all of this brings us back to one final really big question. When you think about everything from the phone in your hand to the massive financial systems that keep the world humming, it's clear we are all just deeply, unavoidably connected. So in a world that's this tangled up, is the whole idea of a truly independent country just an illusion? What do you think?